1836, William Henry Harrison was the first presidential candidate to campaign aboard a train, launching a practice of whistle-stop campaigning that allowed candidates to greet and speak with voters in small towns along the way. One of the most famous presidential railroaders was Harry S. Truman. During his 1948 whistle-stop tour, he traveled more than 28,000 miles and delivered more than 350 speeches. He used the Ferdinand Magellan 1928 Pullman car, specially outfitted with armor plate and bullet-resistant glass for use by President Franklin D. Roosevelt. President Eisenhower was the last commander-in-chief to use that car, although President Reagan used it during an October 1984 trip through Western Ohio. Is whistle-stop campaigning still happening? We have as our guest today an expert who's going to fill us in, so stay with us.
Welcome to Lean to the Left, home of no-holds-barred commentary, plus interviews with fascinating people. Some of them top experts, others simply with interesting stories to tell. You'll never know who'll show up at Lean to the Left. Now here's your host, Bob Gaddy.
Now, Edward Segal is one of the few people to organize a modern-day whistle-stop campaign train tour. He served as a campaign manager, press secretary, and aide to Democratic and Republican presidential and congressional candidates. Segal's the best-selling author of Crisis Ahead and has written for Forbes.com, The Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, New York Times, Los Angeles Times, and other major publications. He has a new book called Whistle Stop Politics, Campaign Trains and the Reporters Who Covered Them. Hey, Edward, thanks so much for being with us on the Lean to the Left podcast.
Great to be with you today, Bob.
Hey, man, tell us a little bit about how whistle-stop campaigning was used by political candidates and about your book.
Political campaigning got its start, of course, when there was the first election. And one of the first presidential candidate to campaign by train was William Henry Harrison in 1836. He didn't win, but it was the first documented situation where a candidate campaigned by train. Of course, he wasn't able to go too far in those days because there simply was not a lot of train tracks, but it really set the tone for the years that came. And over the course of the past 185 years or so, I've documented hundreds and hundreds of candidates, office holders, or office seekers who took advantage of trains and campaigned for office. And that's what my book is all about. Dozens of stories about the candidates, the reporters who covered them, what it was like to campaign from a train, to live on a train, to work on a campaign train. And I wrote the book because I think this is an unfortunate fading part of collective memory. And with each passing generation, people have a tendency to forget a little bit more and more about this important part of American political history.
Okay, can you tell me how many politicians have actually campaigned by train?
I've documented at least 200. And I documented through news clippings over the years, interviews that I did with politicians or staff and reporters, dozens of books that I've combed through in connection with the research. Sometimes these candidates would run for president. Sometimes they would run for governor, House of Representatives. I even found a couple instances where they ran for local offices, such as mayor, where cities had enough treks downtown that candidates running for mayor would actually campaign by train very successfully as well.
That's remarkable. You would never think that a local candidate in a smaller geographical area would do that.
You're absolutely right. And that's one of the benefits of research. Sometimes you never know what you're going to find.
Yeah.
I also came across what apparently was the shortest campaign train trip in American politics. It was only about 600 feet. It was waged in 1966 by a political candidate. He was also a well-known political trickster at the time, Dick Tuck. He was running for state senate in California, and he did a photo op whistle stop on the Angels Flight Railway in downtown Los Angeles. And the route of the train is 300 feet up the slopes and 300 feet down the slopes. But he took advantage of that, what I call political eye candy, to get the attention of the press, and it worked. There was a nice story about him. The AP ran a photo and a cut line,
Yeah.
and news about this photo op, whistle stop, made a lot of local news and helped him in his campaign. He didn't win, of course, but campaigning by train is no guarantee of success. But if you don't try it, you'll never know how well it might work for you in a campaign.
Yeah. What lessons do you think today's politicians could learn from this past whistle stopping candidates?
There's a lot of great lessons today's politicians can learn. Number one, go where the people are. That
Yeah.
was the benefit of the train. The
Yeah.
trains would stop at small and large cities and towns where there was a train depot. That's lesson one, go where the people are. Lesson two, don't talk so much. Keep it short. When politicians campaign by train and their speeches that they made at depots, they would talk for maybe 5 or 10 minutes. They're not long speeches, and then a train would pull out and go to the next station.
So
Another
Donald
important,
Trump could never do it. He talks for hours, right?
that's right. It takes a lot of discipline. It doesn't matter how long you can talk. It's a matter of how little you can say and how short you can keep it. And that's certainly a skill that dozens of whistle-stopping politicians learned and practiced along the way. Another important lesson today, find and use visuals. There's very few visuals as impactful, as attention-getting, as memorable as a large diesel or steam motive train pulling into a railroad station, and the pomp and the circumstances that often accompany these trains. Times there were marching bands and cheerleaders and speeches and rah-rah. It could be quite a production, quite an undertaking, and usually left quite a memory in the minds of people who saw these trains and would pass down these stories generation to generation.
It'd be a pretty big job for staff to prepare for one of those events, especially if it's going from town to town, because staff would have to prepare for all of the stops, right? And gin up crowds in all those places.
Oh yeah, it can be quite a organizational undertaking.
Yeah.
I have firsthand experience because I actually organized and publicized a campaign train tour for a member of Congress in Oklahoma. And that's what really got me interested in the topic. I did a mini version of what would happen today or happen before with presidential and other candidates, mapping the route, getting the train,
Yeah.
planning rallies, coming up with the schedules, getting the right appropriate staff, planning rallies at the train stations, trying to generate news coverage. It was a microcosm of what campaign organizers had to do before I did mine and what they continue to do afterwards.
So you say gin up news coverage. Was that easier because of the train? And as you say, the pomp and circumstance and all of that?
Oh, yeah. In fact, many times, depending upon the campaign and the press that was available, sometimes the news that a presidential campaign train would stop at a local depot would be front page news. And
Sure.
that would be another great way of getting news coverage. And of course, there was great coverage, radio, television later, about what the candidate said, and great visuals of the train pulling up to the station. It was a great way to get the attention of the media, and sometimes hundreds or tens of thousands of people would show up at these trackside rallies, depending upon the size of the city and the community and where the train depot was located. So it was a great, impactful, attention-getting, memorable form of political theater that you rarely see these days.
Yeah, I saw in during the research for this episode, I saw a video of Ronald Reagan's train trip in which he spoke, and it was a huge crowd of people. I was surprised at how, I don't know why I was surprised. It was Reagan.
He was actually retracing Harry Truman's famous campaign tour in
Wow.
Ohio, and he actually used the, the same train car, the
Yeah.
Magellan, that Truman and FDR had used in their campaigns.
All
It was
right.
a great visual, another great instance of political eye candy, and made news around the world.
Yeah, Reagan was a genius at coming up with that kind of stuff, and I guess he probably had staff that was as much of a genius as he was. But given today's technology and the prevalence of social media, do you believe there's Any chance that this form of campaigning will come back and become popular again?
I certainly hope so. They're not out of fashion yet. Joe Biden, when he ran for president in 2020,
Mhm.
he campaigned by train for a few hours.
Mhm.
Barack Obama did that in 2008, and as recently as 2022, and he won his election. Although they're not used as much or as frequently as they had been in the past, they certainly can be a great way to get people's attention if, of course, the candidate has the time, the money, the effort, the skill, the resources, and if he can find a train to rent for whatever it takes to make the tour happen and be successful.
You say find a train to rent, so you wouldn't just jump on Amtrak and say, "Okay, this is my campaign train," right? You you can't do that, right? You got to have your own train.
Oh yeah, the train that my campaign people rented for the campaign train I did in Oklahoma, they rented a four-car configuration. It
Okay.
was two locomotives and two cars, and they rented it from Santa Fe Railway. But these days, the options for where you're going to get a train can be quite limited. And
Yeah.
Amtrak is usually the company of choice to go to see if they can use a train. But you're right, you just can't show up at a railroad station and say, I'm going to ride the train and campaign. It can take weeks or sometimes several months to plan and coordinate a successful campaign tour today.
Okay. So, have you got some interesting stories that you can share with us from the research that you did?
Yeah, I found a lot of things that were news to me, and I think will be news to people who read the book. One of the interesting stories I found was the number of times presidential and other candidates would allow someone to impersonate them from the back of the train or as the train was moving through a depot. And they would, whether it was their aides or sometimes even a reporter or friends or colleagues, would impersonate the candidate, usually so the candidate could get some rest and take time out from the campaign trail, but they did not want to disappoint people who would come from miles around to see them as the train passed through their community. William Jennings Bryan had someone stand in for him once. Eugene Debs, a socialist candidate. FDR, Harry Truman, when he was running for vice president in 1944, even President Eisenhower in 1952. To one degree or another, they all allowed or sometimes encouraged people to impersonate them just so they could take some time off and get some rest.
But didn't people realize that they were seeing a fake? They weren't really seeing a real candidate?
No,
How
sometimes
they
it can't. In the early part, when these candidates were allowed impersonators, the people just did not know what they looked like. It was the early days of campaigning, a lot of no television, of course, very few pictures of what the candidates actually looked like. And
really?
so that helped them to pull a fast one. Others, of course, were very well known, Truman,
Okay.
Eisenhower, but the trains would go by so fast, and just a glimpse, they were expecting to see that candidate or politician. And so that's exactly what they saw. They thought they saw it, but they didn't. Someone impersonated the candidate with their gestures or their mannerisms,
Uh-huh.
and they often fell for it, and they didn't know any differently.
That's a riot. It reminds me of one time I had a job. I worked for a Republican congressman from New Jersey. Yeah, I did. I worked for a Republican, and he was a liberal Republican, though. And he was on the Merchant Marine and Fisheries Committee, and they had a trip to Alaska that he had to go on. And so there was a debate during his campaign for reelection. There was a debate scheduled that should have been between him and his Democratic opponent. So he asked me to go and stand in for him. And so I had to impersonate him. Although everybody knew it was me, not him. I had a lot more hair than he did, for example. And he was taller and he had a crew cut. Anyway, um, I got my lunch handed to me by the Democratic opponent. He then, afterwards, he asked me if he won the election, would I come to work for him? So I guess he thought I did a pretty good job. My boss asked me how it went, but he was off looking at whales or whatever in the hell he was doing. So that was an impersonation. A little different from a presidential candidate having somebody impersonate him on a train, though. It's pretty funny. So, how did campaign trains change the outcome of elections, like with McGovern and Bobby Kennedy, for example?
Sometimes the campaign trains were the tipping point that helped the candidates win, but it was no guarantee. But at
Mhm.
least in two instances, I know that it really helped them to win election. I actually heard from George McGovern when I asked him about his experience, and he wrote back and told me that he thought it was a great way to campaign. He really enjoyed it, and he credited his campaign train tours in California and Nebraska in 1972 for winning those two state primaries. Bobby Kennedy, when he was running for president in 1968, his campaign staff said that the best day of campaigning he had in his short 85-day run for the White House was on
Mhm.
the campaign train in Nebraska. And he spoke at 11 stops, talked to tens of thousands of people. So a lot of candidates have really enjoyed it, speaking to crowds from the back of trains. And sometimes it can be the tipping point to help them win their race.
Do you think in this age of social media and everything that it still is a viable way to campaign?
Oh, yeah, because social media is like everything else, every other form of communications. You've
Mhm.
got to get people's attention.
Mhm.
And campaigning by train is a great form of political eye candy that would do just that. It's an
Sure.
almost irresistible visual for mass media, traditional media, and people who show up, of course. Everyone in the world has their camera. And I
Right.
imagine if they did a campaign train tour today, not only would you have the major media taking pictures, but you'd have everyone at the railroad station who was there pulling out thousands of cameras and posting it on social media.
Sure.
So, in one sense, it could be even more effective because of social media than it
Right.
was ever before.
Yeah, I could see that. You'd have all these people in the crowd taking pictures of the candidate, of the president, or whoever in the heck it is, and sharing it all over the world, all
Yeah,
these people. So you'd be getting a big bang for your buck, I think. You wouldn't have to rely on the local newspaper to show up or the local TV. You want them to show up, but all these people with their cell phones taking videos and taking photos, yeah, that's free coverage, right?
that's right. That's what it's all about.
Yeah. Do you think it'll be used in this 2024 campaign?
I really hope so. No matter who's running or what office they're seeking, they're going to have the age-old problem of getting attention and having opportunities to tell people why they should be elected. And as
Hmm.
long as there is a serviceable set of tracks in the region of where they want to run,
Right.
and they have the time, the money, the resources, and the organizational skills that are needed to pull it off. I really hope at least one presidential candidate will campaign by train, and I hope, as I see fit, perhaps a few candidates running for the House or the Senate or the governor's office will consider doing the same.
Yeah, I could see it to be a very viable way for a governor's race or a state, any kind of a statewide race, if there are train tracks, and most states there are, right?
Oh, yeah. And that was the case in Oklahoma when I did that train tour. We rented the train from Santa Fe Railroad, but the tracks actually, as I recall, belonged to Amtrak. But
Mm.
Amtrak had discontinued service. It was called the Lone Star route, but they gave us permission to run the Santa Fe Railroad configuration on their tracks. And the member of Congress I was working for at the time, he made turned that lemon into lemonade. And
Okay.
actually, when he was campaigning by train, made a promise to people that if he was reelected, he would continue his fight to return train service to that area on those same tracks. So that was a great twofer.
Yeah, I could see that. And for candidates that are pushing infrastructure improvements, it would be a great visual. to use too, wouldn't it?
Yeah, for infrastructure, they could highlight the importance of restoring or improving or building new bridges and
Mhm.
highways,
Mhm.
railroad stations, whatever the
Sure.
infrastructure needs in that particular community.
Yeah,
They could use campaign trains as another way to call people's attention to what needs to be done in their area.
for sure. From your book, what are some cool stories you've got to share with us?
There's a lot of stories. I told you earlier about the presidential and other candidates who allowed people to impersonate them as they were campaigning through their areas.
Right.
But discrimination was also a big issue
Okay.
in our history, and political candidates and their staff and reporters were not immune from what was happening in our society during that time. Jimmy Hicks was a black reporter who was covering the Stevenson campaign in 1952. And when the train pulled into the station in New Orleans and reporters got off to go to a local hotel to stay for the night, because he was black, they would not let him stay in the hotel. So that was a sign of the times. But Eisenhower in 1952, campaigning for president, he took the extraordinary step of making sure that reporters who were black would never have that problem because he had the schedule of his train was such that the train never stopped in a segregated city to stay overnight. So that was a very sensitive, common sense way to deal with that problem of discrimination.
That's amazing. That really is amazing. Wow. Okay. Have you got anything else you'd like to add?
I urge people to take a look at the book because I hope it will rekindle or help educate them about an important part of American political history. The book focuses in not just on the candidates who campaign by train, but also their families, their aides, the reporters who covered them along the way. And also, there's a whole chapter of how others in the US and around the world mimicked campaign trains for their own political, commercial, or other purposes. It's a lot of great stories in the book, and I hope people have the opportunity to read about these stories and educate themselves and pass what they learn on to their friends, families, and colleagues at work. It's a great part of American political history that I'm trying to preserve by having this book published.
It sounds like it'd make a great holiday present. Tell you the truth, I'd like to have one for myself. I need to tell my wife to call you up and say, hey, send Bob your book. So it's called Whistle Stop Politics, Campaign Trains, and the Reporters Who Covered Them, folks. You need to check it out, and I certainly am planning to. I wish I would have been able to see it prior to this interview, but such is the way it is. At any rate, Edward, thank you so much for being with us. I really do appreciate it. Now, people can find your book where? On Amazon, I presume, and where else?
It's on Amazon right now. It's available for pre-ordering. The book will be published on February 13th as an ebook and a
Okay.
hardcover edition. So go to
Okay.
Amazon or go to my website at whistlestoppolitics.com. You can learn more about it and order the book through there as well.
All right, great. Thanks very much for being with us on the Lean to the Left podcast. I think this is a very interesting topic, and I appreciate you being with us today.
Thank you, Bob. I enjoyed the conversation.
Thank you. Hey guys, I hope you enjoyed this Lean to the Left video and that you learned something as well. Please come back on a regular basis and check out our interviews with guests on topics that I hope you find interesting, entertaining, and enlightening. And you can check out the schedule of upcoming shows, guests, and topics at podcast.leantotheleft.net. You can also subscribe to our audio version there or to our video shows here and follow us on social media. Facebook at the Lean to the Left Podcast, Twitter at Lean to the Left 1, Instagram at Bob Gaddy _Lean to the Left, and TikTok at Lean to the Left. Our goal is to be informative and entertaining as we and our guests comment on the latest developments in the news and about the social issues that concern us all. This is Bob Gaddy signing off for Lean to the Left. Thanks for sharing your time with us.